What a beautiful day for a FSMA Friday. Welcome, everybody. I'm your host, Jim Albright, and today we are going to be diving into the world of FSMA 204 to get a closer look at what's needed for building up your food safety culture and data tracing processes, not just to ensure 204 compliance, but also to help drive down some of that cost and increase your productivity. So there's lots to get into, but I see we have a larger group of newcomers today. This is a hot topic. So let me introduce the show to you newcomers. Welcome again. FSMA Friday is a monthly series that's brought to you by Safety Chain and the Atchison Group. This is our way to provide regular updates, insights, and guidance around some of the changes within the Food Safety Modernization Act. And we don't just discuss new methodologies and tools to help F&B companies meet FSMA requirements, but we also give you the opportunity to ask your questions to the great lineup of TAG's seasoned food safety experts. So please send in some questions while we have our great talk today. So just a few housekeeping items here. We've muted all attendee mics, but as I just said, we are leaving room at the end for some Q&A. So please get your comments and questions ready, and we'll address them as time permits. If we happen to run out of time, do not worry. We will absolutely get back to you. Our great presenters over at TAG are always looking forward to some really good questions, and we'll make sure that they get them right after the call. And yes, we are recording this presentation, so be on the lookout in your email inbox because we're going to be sending the recording along with the presentation slides later today. Okay, I am absolutely thrilled to welcome Dr. Liliana Cassell-Wardle, who is the Executive Senior Director of Food Safety and Supply Chain Risk at the Atchison Group. Now, Liliana has her PhD from the Organic Chemistry Department at the University of Buenos Aires and is a certified SQF practitioner as well as an official preventative controls qualified individual. I wish I were. Man, that's awesome. She is also an active member of many food industry groups, including the International Association of Food Protection and the Institute for Food Technology. So Liliana, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jim. Happy to be here. And I would like to add that I'm also now a lead instructor for the PCQI course. So
wow, great.
Happy to have anybody join me. My background in the industry very quickly started with the business of cocoa and chocolate. I worked with a small plant in Brazil and the US called Endeca and UCP, where they were grinding the cocoa for chocolate and processing. And then I have 18 years with the Hershey company, managing suppliers, licensing, food service, the Hershey plants, and Hershey co-manufacturing for products that were made to be shipped all over the world, including the US. So I am happy to share my experiences with the Atchison Group. I have been here 4 years, and of course have expanded the categories of products that we manage, and have been in other very interesting areas, including seafood. So among others. So it's great to be here, and I would like to share with the group any questions that you have at the end that we might not be able to answer. Please let Jim or both of us know, and we'll be happy to address them. Glad to be here and join you all. So we are going to talk a little bit about very little about what's new on FSMA in general, and this is a side conversation, but the produce safety rule was updated to address, to provide a final guidance on cleaning and sanitation, the management of agricultural water, focusing on SPROUT operations, environmental monitoring, and record keeping. And record keeping is going to drive us to our next topic, which is going to be talking about FSMA 204 and the requirements of the Food Traceability Act, the needs to have and the nice to have, and the tools to manage traceability, which food safety culture, of course, is a key tool, because to have ongoing, consistent food safety systems, you need to have a culture of behaviors in your workforce. And of course, using tools to support your data management is upfront in the list to support the management of traceability. So if we look at the supply chain, the complexity of the supply chain hit us quite a bit during the COVID pandemic because there were a lot of things to handle, and it was not easy to get to know your suppliers. Nobody could travel, so but the people had to continue eating. So it was that scenario where almost every company fell a little bit in the black box. Okay, but the supply chain is complex. There's structural complexity because many suppliers are not single suppliers and they manage different levels of the supply chain and different ingredients for packaging. Uh, if you are sourcing globally, of course, financial and political situations are going to be hurdles that you need to understand to manage your supply chain, and the trends that the consumers have as well, and of course, front and center natural disasters. When we talk a little bit more about this complexity, I always like to bring up, of course, the managing of the unpredictable, the many regulatory environments that, of course, anything that is brought to the US has to comply with US regulations, which is the Foreign Supply Verification Program, FSMA compliance, and other requirements. But they have their own regulatory environments that they also have to comply. So uh, it is important to understand the similarities and the difference between those regulatory environments. The cultural changes, multiple cultures drive programs in different ways. So understanding the management of their culture in the regions that they are, uh, and the unpredictables, like I said, okay? So what are the trends that we have to look into? Global emerging technologies. We have AI now front and center, and everybody is using AI. So we have to learn how to manage AI to give us the information that we need for the use that we needed. Sustainability is extremely important. Many companies are already tying their sustainability efforts with their food safety systems because that is a consumer expectation, being sustainable to protect the planet. Emerging technologies like using fermentation techniques for alternative proteins, for example, is one. Using clean label trends, using shelf life extenders that are not chemicals or highly processed substances, and instead of that, sourced and uh, not heavily modified. Okay, innovation strategies. The trends are that people are starting to have different expectations for their food, okay? And that is going to impact how we manage our supply chain. So keep in mind, you don't know what you don't know. And that is very important because you have to try to find out what you don't know to know how to manage and be compliant with a regulatory environment that has to be uh, preventing the foreseeable known risks and being alert to address emerging risks that could happen that were not the regular ones for those product categories. So how is traceability going to help us? Okay, the goal of the traceability rule is to protect public health. Why? Because when you have good traceability and you can get to the sourcing steps for an ingredient or packaging that is food contact, you're going to understand better where your risks could be in that process and address them faster so that the smallest number of consumers that could be impacted by a failure are reduced, okay? Food defense or an economically motivated adulteration is another important one, especially if the economically motivated adulteration poses a risk to food safety. And for years, we've been talking about the melamine in milk, and that has been an issue. FDA has had blanket import alerts for milk coming from China, for example. But there are other areas where economically motivated adulteration can be less known, but yes, still very, very risky because it can impact the consumer's health. Okay, so the transparency of the supply chain is absolutely important and very relevant, as well as quality control, of course, and sustainability. So the new era of smarter food safety, we have all been hearing about the new era of smarter food safety, and there are three key points that are within the scope of this presentation, because FDA in the blueprint had included the four core elements. Three of these cover the tech-enabled traceability rule, smarter tools and approaches for prevention and outbreak response, and food safety culture. Okay, and they all have to do on what do you do to consistently have visibility of your traceability to be assured that you're going to protect the health of the consumer on every product that is made. So understanding the supply chain, having good and tech-enabled traceability with tools that can help you really have a preventive approach are going to manage better an outbreak response. So what does the traceability rule bring, FSMA 204? What does it bring to the table? It brings to the table a requirement for enhanced tracking and tracing of food, okay? And it applies to people that who manufacture, process, pack of whole foods that appear on the food traceability list. So FDA has identified a list of foods, and I encourage you to go to the rule and read it, okay? That are part of that list where the risk of an outbreak could be higher, and the risk is based, the traceability rule, what it is addressing is acute risk of biological contamination and of control of pathogens that could be toxin producers, so chemical toxins that could cause acute health impacts on the lives of the consumers, okay? Those high-risk foods are part of the food traceability list. The requirements are for those traceability, for those products involved in the traceability list, records are required that they have to contain key data elements associated with critical tracking events. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Keep in mind that for these elements, FDA requires a communication within 24 hours, and the compliance date for the rule is January 2026. And by now, I hope you all took notes of that, because you got to celebrate that it gives us a good 2 years to be compliant with the regulation. Okay, so time to start working on it and comfortably having a good understanding of your systems. So the events, the critical tracking events are going to be those that involve some kind of event happening to your ingredients in this case. For example, harvesting, if there's a cooling before initial packaging, if there's an initial packing of raw agricultural commodities other than those obtained from a fishing vessel, first land baits received from a food obtained from a fishing vessel, the shipping, the receiving, and then the transformation of the food. So if you work in a facility that receives a commodity like this, you're going to work with the suppliers to have understanding of all the process that happened to that ingredient before you're receiving it on your facility. So the key data elements that you have to have for those critical tracking events are the traceability lot codes, and it is important that you understand those lot codes. And some companies are using a system called GS1, which can it's an electronic system and can help you track codes backwards and continue that tracking throughout to the finished product. It's not mandatory to use a system like that. So what the regulation is going to require is that everybody understands the lot coding process for their supply chain source commodities, and understand them, and being able to manage them to be able to provide that response to FDA in 24 hours. Okay. If you think about it, when you don't know how your suppliers are doing that coding, you might spend hours on the phone trying to understand how the supplier of your supplier is coding their product for you to understand how it impacted your facility. Okay. So the traceability of the lot codes, the product descriptions, the quantities, and the units of measure, and I'm sure all of you have some kind of a system where they track lot coding in this way. The date the food was received, shipped, harvested, cooled, and packed. So those dates are very important because it's going to show you, for example, how much time it was in a vessel, if it was part of the supply chain that might be causing an outbreak or not, or it's outside the scope of it. Uh, if anything happened during those dates where the product was being handled in different ways, received or shipped or harvested, and how did that impact? Let's say, for example, it's coming in a vessel, and the vessel is flooded because there's a hurricane or a close hurricane, and so it impacts the commodities that that vessel is hiring. You can track those events through good traceability of your lot codes to know what product needs to be disposed or not. Okay. The location description for where activities occurred. So if you have an ingredient that is harvested in Thailand but is shipped to Indonesia to be packed, and is shipped to Manila to be shipped from there, and this is a crazy example but not impossible. Okay. So think of those scenarios and try to investigate with your suppliers how they manage the supply chain, and how much you need to know, even having a flow diagram or a decision tree to understand the risk of each step of your supply chain ingredients, the risk of each step, and the time frame that it takes to manage it. Okay. So what is a traceability plan? A traceability plan is going to describe the procedures that you use to maintain the records required. And we saw the list before. Okay. The procedures that you use to identify the food and the food traceability list, how you assign your lot codes, and who are the points of contact for questions about your traceability plan and records. And that has to be built. My advice is it should not be overcomplicated. There's some facilities that decide that for their commodities to track each of those processes, they're going to use lot codes that might have uh, the last four digits of the plant registration if they're registered with FDA, or use a Julian code that everybody agrees to track it. But simplify it, but understand the process of what happened before and how many steps before there were uh, critical tracking events that happened to your ingredients that you need to know about. Okay. So who is required to have a traceability plan? If you grow or raise a food that is on the food traceability list, uh, other than eggs, it is important to even have a farm map showing the areas in which you grow or raise the food. So for example, I had the opportunity to meet a grower of berries, and they had the land really traced to determine how many plants of each area that was uh, lined for them were made on each piece of land, and that would be helpful. Imagine if there's a flood, if there's running water from rain that comes from a site facility, and it doesn't impact all your lots, but it impacts some. It's very easy to narrow your risk, knowing how how to manage these, having a good farm map. Okay. uh, on the maps, the information that you need to have needs to be retained for 2 years. So any updates that you make to that traceability plan you need to keep the records for 2 years, okay? So what are the records requirements? FDA is not imposing anything. You have to do it electronically or you have to do it manually. You can have paper, electronic, or true copies allowed. The requirement that they have is they must be available within 24 hours of a request. And if you're not going to be able to meet that, you need to communicate with FDA and agree on some reasonable time. Just think that if the purpose of these traceability rules is really to be able to narrow the products impacted and the root cause of what caused the deviation, requesting an extension of a week, for example, is probably not going to be well received. Okay, so you've got to think about that, and not only think about that, plan it and test it through mock exercises. Okay. Uh, and of course, communicate with FDA as needed is if there is any deviation in your supply chain that relates to the rule. The other thing that I want to highlight is that FDA requires for any record that it must be in English so that they can read it. So make sure that you have time to manage that requirement. If your supplier has records in Chinese, but you have to pull some records, make sure that there's some way that those can be translated to make them readable for FDA. So when FSMA was implemented, it did have the requirement to designate high-risk foods. So this has been something that FDA has been working on for a long time, okay, in managing how to build a rule that really enhance the traceability to be able to protect the public health of the consumer. So they developed a risk ranking model for food traceability, which is data-driven, science-based decision support tool. And it's a semi-quantitative tool that FDA has developed where they have assigned the risk, again, like I told you earlier before, based on the acute impact of pathogens involved that could create an outbreak and pathogens that could create toxins, for example, like Staph aureus or Clostridium botulinum, or any of those are going to be part of the list. And that risk ranking model for food traceability is part of the regulation. There's two very good tables on the regulations that help you look at that and address the foods on the traceability list and how it has been expanded to other products that may contain the commodities that are in the traceability list. And they have paired the hazard risk to the commodities risk based on foreseeable known risks to be able to help the industry address these issues and have a good, strong focus on preventive control, okay? So based on this, FDA developed a model of 7 criteria for scoring commodity hazard pairs using the criteria that FDA had based on the FSMA statutory factors. Those statutory factors were part of the FSMA regulation. So FDA continued to work on this to create this 7 criteria for scoring, and they have provided a list of the scores for each of those high-risk products. So the statutory factors were the known safety risk of a particular food, the history and the severity of the foodborne illness outbreak. So based on this, they used CDC data to build those. They added the likelihood of high potential risk for microbial or chemical contamination supporting the growth of pathogen organisms. So the challenges that nature might bring or that the processes might bring to contaminate those high potential risk ingredients. They have also looked into, as a factor, the point in the manufacturing process where contamination is most likely to occur, okay? For example, in the handling, if there's hand handling, if in the receiving area, if there's a lot of handling of receiving when receiving the commodities, okay? Then they have looked at the likelihood of contamination and the steps taken during the manufacturing process to prevent this. For example, having a strong environmental monitoring program to look at risk in the process, okay? They have looked based on foodborne illness data. They have looked at the likelihood that consuming a particular food will result in a foodborne illness, and also looked at the known severity. How much hospitalization has there been, and how much was the economic impact of these outbreaks because of foreseeable known risks. And if you can see, I'm repeating a lot this word foreseeable known risk, because it is language that FDA has highlighted and is highlighting for the PCQI courses. So keep in mind that you have information within the FDA website to better understand. You have Appendix 1, which offers great information on these potential foreseeable risks, okay? So with those statutory factors, the food traceability list scores and gives semi-quantitative score to the commodity hazard pair according to the information relevant for the frequency of outbreaks and occurrences of illnesses, the severity of the illness, okay, the likelihood of contamination, if the trends of the processes designed are those that could have a likelihood of contamination, the potential for pathogen growth with consideration of shelf life, okay? So if throughout the shelf life there's a risk for pathogen growth because of the process that it had, the probability of process contamination and industry-wide intervention. They have also looked at the consumption rate and amount consumed. So can the risk be that high that one consumption could be the cause of a recall, for example? Or does it need frequent ingestions, for example? Or does it need a higher portion level? And they have used the history of all these to build this data, and then the cost of illnesses, okay? And again, when you think about consumption rate and amount consumed, this is not talking about chronic contaminations, for example, with heavy metals like lead, or it's focusing, or for material control, it's focusing on biological risk control of pathogens that can cause diseases or can produce toxins that can cause diseases, okay? Very specific. So again, we go to the tools for compliance, because when we talk about designing your processes, we looked at this slide already, and we talked about tech-enabled traceability. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about what tools we're going to be using to manage our supply chain. So to manage the supply chain, you have to use managing behaviors within your supply chain. So what tools do you have? Okay, you're going to build a supply chain of approved suppliers. So you're going to use your own tools and review theirs and have them share theirs, to support and educate the members of your supply chain. And when I talk about educating, I'm not talking about training them on what frequency to put to review the critical points on their HACCP plan. I'm talking to them about explaining them why it is important, why they have to control it, what are the risks, okay? Then use communication tools, sharing best practices. Talking about food safety, sharing food safety best practices is not an industry secret, okay? It's a great tool to have a strong supply chain built with your suppliers. So you share best practices, you talk about opportunities, and you share what you have implemented in your own facilities, in your own supply chain system to manage your supplier, to build knowledge, okay? Have shared simulation exercise to understand how they're going to be compliant, and how they're going to check effectiveness. For example, time your processes. Will you be able to comply an FDA request of 24 hours? How much time do you need within your supply chain management programs to get the data for FDA? You have to add that time coming from your supplier. So you have to know how much time they need, and needs to be rounded up to be able to provide a response before 24 hours, okay? You're going to lead by example, because you're going to lead by sharing best demonstrated practices, and you're going to use methods of recognitions and incentives, because you're going to privilege those that are willing to have a mindset of continuous improvement. So you're going to strive for consistency, but you're going to be change ready. How are you going to do that? You're going to help your suppliers. You're going to review what tools your suppliers are using for data management. Okay. If you identify that your suppliers can only provide data in 2 days, you're going to work with them to see how you can improve that. And you're going to establish shared KPIs where the effectiveness of your suppliers then show you how effective your supply chain is. Okay, you're going to do trends, and here's where safety chain really is a great partner for TAG, because safety chain provides these tools, and I'm not here giving a commercial for safety chain. Okay, but the importance of what they do is very relevant, and we have to keep it in mind. Okay, if you know your supply chain and you know the strength of your suppliers, you understand what is working and what is not. And you manage failure as a learning experience. Use it for education and training, use it for improvement, use it for post-mortem evaluations and new learning opportunities. Another great tool is when failure did not happen because you had a near miss that you were able to control, and it became a learning experience in your supply chain model and in your supplier's supply chain model. So having KPIs for success is a great food safety culture tool to build that hazard awareness that we want the supply chain to have as part of food safety culture, okay? Now, to be consistent, you've got to be adaptable. You require consistency, okay, but you've got to be adaptable to work on those near misses, to learn how to manage failure, and to have tools ready in case you need to manage your failure, and test those with your suppliers. Global cultures provide you unique social markers. So to build a strong food safety culture, try to incorporate with your supplier markers of their cultures. For example, create a food safety culture journey that can be related to, for example, if you go to South America, a soccer team. Everybody's passionate for soccer. So why can't we use a soccer model to have a good prepared supply chain that can understand what their role is for the team and what they're going to have to do to manage the process, okay? And then you establish verification practices through audit and record reviews. So the maturity of the food safety culture in the supply chain is really a necessity for success with your supply chain. So the maturity of the food safety culture has to do with an expansion of food safety culture outside the FSQA area. So you're going to have key stakeholders from cross-functional teams, and you're going to require that the CEO, the senior leaders are part of that model. Cross-functional activities like procurement, of course, food safety and quality, your product development teams, your distribution and transportation, sales, marketing. It is important that everybody is aware and that you work with that supply chain with cross-functional teams to build the strength of a shared, mature food safety culture, okay? How are you going to do it? You're going to learn from each other. You're going to share successes and failures, and you're going to build KPIs where your external partners have scorecards for performance, and you can understand where their strengths are and what their opportunities for improvement are, okay? So success relies on ongoing data sharing and review and enhanced communication. And this is critical. Communication is a key to make sure that you are always understanding the strengths and opportunities of your supply chain, okay? Remember that slide where I said you don't know what you don't know? Well, you have to find out what you don't know, and communication is your tool, okay? Tier tools for continuous improvement. For example, if you have digital systems that allows you to share information from your suppliers, and you have a portal for your suppliers where they can share their information, their KPIs, okay? What is working and what is not, what kind of near misses they had. That's going to help you understand which of those suppliers is the strongest and which of those suppliers needs the most your help. And of course, a system of rewards and recognition. We all like to be recognized in different ways. So those tools are always very helpful also for your supply chain. A verification of the food safety culture of your supply chain goes hand in hand with a good assessment of the maturity of that food safety culture, okay? So the rule does not establish a requirement for digital tools, okay? But there are multiple benefits for companies that do that, because remember that time frame of compliance, which is 24 hours, okay? And you have to be agile for that. You cannot tell your supplier they have 24 hours, because you have to receive that data and manage it and tie it to your production and your shipping. And so you've got to build those times, okay? You have to have easily accessible capabilities for trending of results and verification of effectiveness. So look at those trends, and not only look at those trends, but understand what is done to address any trends that are not that satisfactory. Okay, what was used, document that, address it, work with your suppliers to modify it. And then results and trends can easily become visual aids, and that is a wonderful tool to have your workforce involved and understanding how they're doing. If they are handling your ingredients, your packaging material, having that supplier understanding how they are going and how that is helping your facility, and having tiered KPIs that you can both uh, share with your workforce, this becomes a very important tool for success. So what is a nice to have and a must have for the traceability rule? We talked a lot about the traceability rule, and keep in mind that the design of the traceability rule is almost to surgically protect the health of the consumers, okay? The objective is not to have an expansion of risk for weeks and weeks. And if you remember the lettuce incident that kept growing and growing and growing, uh, that the traceability wants to say, okay, it's 2 days of production that are going to be involved, and it's going to affect 6 days of production for X facility, not 3 months, okay? So it can reduce the impact of a recall and the financial risk and brand protection. So it is a great tool to have. It's a nice to have to protect you from financial risk and brand protection, and is a great tool to have your company do predictions and optimize operations. When you have good data that you can share and you can see the ups and downs of your process, you're going to, of course, impact your productivity and your output, of course, and your efficiency and traceability and transparency. So, what are our key takeaways? Our key takeaways: the compliance with the regulation is going to be by January 20. This does not mean the regulation is complicated, because it requires really a digging into the supply chain, and many companies have already been doing that for some time. Others are starting now. I strongly recommend that everybody goes and reads the rule and follows the tools that the rule is offering, uh, to be able to build that into your food safety systems, okay? The investment on data tracing might bring added benefits on cost saving and enhanced productivity. Why? Because data is going to give you full, fast visibility of where your strengths are in compliance with the rule, and what are your weaknesses in your supply chain. Something to watch, okay? And FDA has not said anything about that, but if this is a requirement for the global supply chain, which it is, the FSVP program is going to see the reflection of this requirement in the requirements for FSVP compliance in foreign supply chains. Why? Because even if the FSVP at this point is not saying include compliance with the traceability rule, you are going to have to start building on that to make sure that your suppliers are ready to comply by January 2026. Okay. And has the semi-quantitative hazard analysis that FDA has developed for about 200 finished products, tying that commodity hazard semi-quantitative evaluation is going to something that is going to bring change in the future, predictable change in the looking of the hazard analysis for different product categories. Because if FDA is offering that data together with Appendix 1, some of those 200 products that are on the FSMA 204 regulation, of course, are in Appendix 1 as well. And that tying of those data is going to have companies start revisiting their hazard analysis to make sure that they are adequately leveraged. So with that, I left almost 20 minutes for questions. So happy to take any questions.
Well, I'm over here giving you a standing ovation, Liliana. That was amazing. Really good stuff that a lot of folks, I'm sure, took a lot of notes. I know I did. I think there's a theme here. I'm looking at the questions that are coming in, and there's definitely a lot of maybe confusion on how to manage your suppliers. And I know you addressed that through KPIs and through kind of using measurements to help course correct things like that. So obviously the supply chain is a global supply chain, and you just mentioned it now, where you're saying, okay, there's different foreign rules than there are here in North America. How does a company kind of stay ahead of understanding what those changes and those rules are in order to meet those specific compliance needs?
Mhm. So it is a great question, Jim. Thanks for sharing it. Uh, the first step for companies that have global suppliers is to understand how they manage their supply chain, understand how they do their lot coding and tracing, who are their suppliers, what does their supplier approval program look like, and their monitoring of suppliers program look like? What do they do? What are the key drivers? Do they review the HACCP plans, for example? Do they review GFSIers? Do they require GFSI? Why? Because part of that is understanding the strength of your suppliers. Okay, the traceability rule is talking about traceability. So understanding how they manage traceability, how they do their exercises on mock recall exercises and mock traceability exercises to
Hmm,
see how strong they are. If you are at the farm level, how are the farmers managing that requirement of having the different lots of the farm where they're planting their commodities? How do they have them framed so that they can know if what they picked up on Tuesday of last week was from lot A, B, or C? So again, the common denominator here is communication, understanding your suppliers, and then aligning your supply chain requirements to what they are doing and
right.
assessing if what they are doing is effective to comply with this regulation and with FSMA and the FSVP program.
Right. And it's just cascading those requirements, things that are expected of you as a food processor manufacturer, all the way down to your supplier. Even if it is not required to them, that is sort of just how we do business now, right? Would you say that's
Yes.
correct?
Yes. So the important part is what you need to have is good traceability on what you bring to your facility. What is nice to have is to have a good in-depth understanding of how effective and how consistent your suppliers are in delivering that.
Right.
have they really established a process where there's not going to be any misses of miscoded product or product that shouldn't have left the facility and did leave it? So understanding your supply chain, diving into it, if you have the opportunity to visit your suppliers, that's going to be great, okay?
Right.
Because not only you're knowing what they're doing, you're building relationships and you're providing solutions together. If you
Yeah.
don't have that opportunity, just GFSI audits, I would say, is a starting point. You have to
Mhm.
know more and do shared exercises of mock traceability and mock recall.
Right. I was just going to bring up those simulated exercises that you were talking about. You know, there's no one size fits all for that type of thing. So how do you know that your supplier is kind of going through those motions and kind of coming up with the achievement that you're expected from your customers or from the regulators? So is there like a template, or does TAG have some type of resource that can help guide in simulated exercises?
Yes, absolutely. We can help guide exercises. We have done a few of those, and of course we include timing and performance on traceability, how much could be recovered with the information that they have. And we have helped a few clients identify where they had their gaps, okay, that they discover later that they would have had more product. And it's great to discover it in a mock exercise. But I mean, there's a lot of value in doing those and getting ready for those starting now. You have 2 years for compliance with this rule. There
Right.
is great information on the FDA website for the requirements of the rule, but also exercise what you have and see what your strengths in your supply chain are for your traceability and what the weaknesses are for those suppliers that you know very little of.
Yeah, and this goes to my next question. So you talked about the key data elements and the critical tracking events. Is that an area that you find in your experience, or others maybe over at TAG, that's kind of a challenge for some manufacturers, is to be able to have those lot codes or descriptions put in place that would satisfy this requirement. And again, I know we're 2 years away for the actual uh, requirement to be set in place, but overall, is that the biggest area that folks are challenged on in your experience?
I would say it's some of the area. It's part of it, and we have to get used to that. But many companies already have it in place. I mean, the certification schemes have required traceability exercise one lot before, one lot after already. So
Hmm.
there is a starting point. What this regulation requires really is that you know more about your suppliers than just that one step behind, and you really verify that they are doing the same thing. Okay, so that at the end of the day, you can trace your products back to where the farming area or the initial packaging area where the polymers were processed, for example. Okay.
Yeah.
Uh, and
So
that's why digital tools really help on that, because the more you can have digital tools that help you, the faster you can see that information. And the GS1
right.
system is a tool that carries that with a structured uh, code building that can be followed in the different steps in those critical tracking events.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. There's this question going back to food safety culture. You had mentioned the maturity point. How do you actually assess the maturity of your food safety culture?
Well, there are several models to assess the maturity. TAG has one, and it uses the 5 dimensions of food safety culture: the mission and the vision, the people, consistency, adaptability, and hazard risk and awareness. And those are part of the of an article built by the GFSI working group.
Mm,
And they provide good information, but there's different ways of assessing it. And some of them stronger than others, but it is manageable. And there are certain pillars that you look at in food safety culture where when you have when you know the strength of your workforce and your programs and the behaviors, because you're working more with near misses than with failures on the process, for example, you understand that your culture is evolving. But anybody that wants to know more about that can reach out to you or me, and we can talk more about that. We have an assessment, but I mean, it's not the only thing that is in the market.
Right. No, that makes sense. GFSI schemes. I'm sure everybody on this call has heard of it or has already become certified in one of them. But yeah, that's kind of your fast track into it, making sure that you'll be compliant to 204 when it hits on 2026.
Mhm.
You had mentioned the need for a strong environmental monitoring program, and that kind of falls into which manufacturing process steps might be higher at risk. Would that be part of your food safety culture maturity assessment as well?
It would fall into the category of hazard risk and awareness, and
Yeah.
yes, it would be part. And some companies just look at the maturity through how effective their environmental monitoring program is, uh, to to drive the company to that mindset of seek and destroy. Okay, so they shouldn't be
Uh-huh.
complacent and thinking, oh, I'm not finding anything, so I'm great. Okay, they should say, I have to do better. If they're in that position, they have to say, I have to do better to find. Okay.
Yeah, that brings us back around to that visibility and into your traceability. And again, like you said, you don't know what you don't know. So make sure that you have the mechanisms in place to see where everything is sort of at risk or potentially at risk.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit. You had a slide here. I think it was around the traceability plan itself, but it was talking about exceptions for farms or food retailers or other groups that are based on the value of food sold. So there's a couple of questions that are coming in around like, hey, I operate some restaurants or food retail stores. What are my responsibilities to be compliant?
Uh, so uh, for restaurants, obviously the supply chain is really at the produce level and at the raw commodities level, and the tool provides the guidelines they need to understand. Let's say you are going to be sourcing the berries, for example, or lettuce. Understand what your growers are doing, how they're tracking the lot codes, uh, and how they're managing their their critical tracking events, who packs the product, for example, who ships the product. Okay, to understand those and have knowledge of those at the level of their supply chain. If they need to look at it in more detail, we can spend some time on that. Okay, separately.
Right. There's a story here from Raymond. Well, it's not a story, but they import fish and crustacean shellfish from 4 different continents. And Raymond's question is, where should the CTE start, the critical tracking event? Oh,
uh,
I'm sorry, I missed a critical point. The shellfish is harvested from aquaculture ponds.
mhm. So it should start at agriculture ponds. Okay, it should start there where the shellfish is grown, and have a lot tracking at that point, and start understanding all the changes, which are the critical tracking events. What happens when it's brought to the facility? What happens when it's packed? Is it ready to eat or not? Or is it a raw commodity? Okay, the shipment process and the receiving process.
Okay. In again, your experience as you're going on site, you're talking to plant managers, you're talking to FSQA folks, you're talking to senior leaders. Where is, in your experience, where is there this sort of drop off in understanding on the importance of FSMA 204 and the urgency behind meeting compliance sooner than later?
Um, I'm not going to say that there is a shortfall, or I mean, what I am going to say is those that are really in the path of being ready are those that have already started to dig into what their supply chain is doing, how their supply chain is managing it. And I'm going to go to that example of the seafood, for example. Okay, uh, whoever is managing the aquaculture process, what is their design for traceability? How are they looking into that? How do they tie it to their data, for example, on the oxygen levels at the pond for the aquaculture, the
Right,
checks
right,
on contaminants on the aquaculture, that level, how are they working on that, and how the other steps of the project continue to manage those. So the scope of the rule is asking you to trace, but part of the food safety standard is asking you to understand at each step what are the foreseeable known risks that they could have. Okay, so I mean, there's no established steps for weaknesses or for strengths. It has to do with how much you know about your supply chain. And keep in mind that if in your facilities you have strong food safety systems that are managing from the cleaning of the lines, the management of allergens, the packing of the product, the kill step, if you're managing that, your suppliers are doing the same thing, and you know a lot less about them because you don't have enough resources that level to be with your suppliers every day like you are with your facilities.
right, right. Wow. Okay. And then kind of to cap it off, as we're looking here at time, you talked about using different communication tools. And I know you mentioned things like, well, your supplier KPIs is a way to communicate with your suppliers because you can see the trends and then you can course correct as needed. You can do the same thing at your facilities. Are there any best practices around communication just in general that you like to share?
I think the best practices for me are the frequency of the communications. Okay, the easy access that you might have, and sometimes there are language barriers, but with even the translation tools that we have now in our softwares, I mean, you can really communicate on a fast pace with your suppliers, and you can look at the trends of data. So the frequency of communication and the strength of your communication, and how comfortable are those suppliers to share with you their mistakes, their failures, their near misses. Okay, uh, it's great to know when everything is going right, but mistakes happen, so it's good to build a strong relationship so that you can understand when those mistakes happen and help them address them.
Right. Yeah, trending is very, very important, obviously, as we're talking about traceability, but also potential risks, identifying those and getting ahead of them
Mhm.
before they become a little bit more urgent. So, all good. There's obviously a lot more that we can talk about in terms of how we can structure different processes and use technology to help with tracing. But I think I'm going to call it for now, just because I'm looking at some of the questions and I believe we've answered most of them. There are a couple that are a little bit more, I guess, direct to that audience member's situation. So Liliana, I'm going to forward that off to you, but in case anybody has any other questions after this call, please do send them along. You can see some email addresses for the Atchison Group right there. You can also visit safetychain.com. We have a ton of resources, including the ultimate guide on food traceability that was written in partnership with the Atchison Group. So please do check that out. Liliana, thank you so much for spending your time. Oh, another question just came in. It's from my daughter. Hey, can I get some free Hershey bars? Maybe I'll talk to you about that a little bit offline, but thank you so much, Liliana. Thank you everybody for joining us today. We had a great time and we hope to see you next month on FSMA Friday.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everybody. Pleasure
Take
to
care
meet
now.
you all. Bye.
Bye.